14,000 years ago, in the middle of the Ice Age, a puppy was dying, and that should have been the end of the story, because Ice Age humans were not rich, they weren't comfortable, they didn't have spare food, spare time, or spare energy. A bad hunting season could kill you. A bad winter could kill you. Sometimes people died simply because there wasn't enough to go around, which is why one archaeological discovery makes almost no sense. Somebody kept that puppy alive for weeks, maybe longer. They fed it, protected it, cared for it, not because it was useful, not because it could hunt, not because it could defend the camp. It was sick, weak, a liability. Every scrap of food given to that puppy was food that couldn't be eaten by a human. And yet someone made that trade anyway. Why? Because the deeper archaeologists looked, the stranger the pattern became. Dogs buried beside humans. Imagine digging a grave in the Ice Age. The ground is frozen. The work is exhausting. Every calorie matters. And yet somebody spent hours doing it anyway. Not for a child, not for a relative, for a dog. Then they lowered the animal into the grave, covered it, and walked away. Thousands of years later, archaeologists uncovered the site and realized something strange. This wasn't disposal. It looked a lot more like grief. Foxes buried beside humans, animals treated with care, animals treated with respect, sometimes animals treated almost like family. And thousands of years later, we're still doing it. People run into burning buildings for pets, refuse evacuation orders because their dog can't come, jump into freezing water for animals they've never even met. Which raises a question that sounds simple until you really think about it. Why? Why do humans care so much about animals? Because from a survival perspective, this behavior is completely irrational. And yet we've been doing it for thousands of years. The strangest part? The answer may reveal something far more important than why we love animals. It may reveal something about what made us human in the first place. Imagine you're sleeping on the street. It's cold. You're exhausted. You haven't eaten properly in days. Then somebody offers you a way out. A warm bed, food, safety, one condition. The dog can't come. A surprising number of people refuse. They stay outside. Not because they don't understand the offer. Not because they don't want the bed. Because leaving the animal behind feels worse. And if that sounds irrational, that's because it is. Humans do this kind of thing all the time. People run into burning buildings for pets. Jump into freezing water for dogs. Refuse evacuation orders because their cat is still inside. During Hurricane Katrina, some people ignored rescue instructions because shelters wouldn't take their animals. Think about how strange that is. Your brain is supposed to keep you alive. That's its entire job. It's why fear exists. It's why pain exists. It's why your hand pulls away from a hot stove before you even think about it. And yet, somehow, millions of people are willing to override that system for an animal. Not for a child, not for a relative, not even for another human, for an animal. And the strange part is that this isn't a modern quirk. This isn't something that appeared once people became comfortable. The deeper archaeologists dig into the past, the more they find evidence that humans have been making this exact mistake for thousands of years. Which brings us back to that dying puppy. Because if modern people risk their lives for animals, what were Ice Age hunter-gatherers willing to sacrifice? 14,000 years ago, that puppy should have died. Not eventually, immediately. Because the disease it had wasn't the kind of illness you simply recovered from. It would have been weak, feverish, barely able to move. The kind of animal most hunter-gatherers would have looked at and assumed wasn't making it through the week. And under normal circumstances, they'd probably be right. Because Ice Age life was brutal. People weren't choosing between different brands of dog food. They were choosing between eating and not eating. Every hunt was a gamble. Every winter was a test. A single injury could become a death sentence, which is why this discovery is so strange. The puppy didn't die. It survived long enough for the disease to run its course, long enough to heal, long enough that researchers believe it must have received continuous care from humans. Think about what that means. Someone had to feed it. Someone had to carry it. Someone had to spend time and energy keeping it alive, not for a day, not for a weekend, for weeks, maybe longer. And what makes this so difficult to explain is that the puppy wasn't giving much back. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't protecting anyone. It wasn't helping gather food. From a survival perspective, it was a terrible investment. Yet somebody made that investment anyway. Somewhere in the Ice Age, a human looked at a dying animal and decided it was worth saving. During Hurricane Katrina, thousands of people refused evacuation orders because pets weren't allowed. Some stayed behind, some nearly died, some actually died. Think about that. A hurricane is coming. The government is telling you to leave, and your response is, "Not without my dog." And the strangest part? This wasn't a one-time accident, because as archaeologists kept digging, they found evidence of something even harder to explain. The puppy wasn't the only animal humans seemed to care about. In fact, one discovery suggests we may have been treating animals like family long before dogs became humanity's best friend. At this point, you could tell yourself a simple story. Maybe humans just got attached to dogs. Maybe dogs were useful. Maybe they helped with hunting, protection, or tracking. Problem solved. Except archaeology refuses to cooperate, because one of the strangest discoveries in this entire story wasn't a dog. It was a fox. Thousands of years ago in what is now Jordan, archaeologists uncovered a human grave associated with the remains of a fox. Not a wolf, not a dog, a fox. And that's a problem, because foxes never became humanity's best friend. They never pulled sleds, never guarded villages, never helped us hunt mammoths. As far as survival goes, they're a terrible choice. So why was one buried this way? Nobody knows for sure, but the possibility is difficult to ignore. Long before dogs conquered the world, humans may have already been forming emotional relationships with animals, not because the animals were useful, not because they were necessary, but simply because they were there. And the deeper researchers looked, the harder it became to dismiss these discoveries as accidents, because this wasn't just a fox. Again and again, ancient graves began revealing the same strange pattern. Animals weren't always being treated like property. Sometimes they were being treated like something much closer to family. And one burial in particular makes that possibility almost impossible to ignore. For thousands of years, they lay underground together. A woman, a puppy, then archaeologists uncovered the grave, and suddenly, a moment that nobody was supposed to see reappeared. Her hand appeared to be resting on the animal, not holding a weapon, not holding a tool. A puppy! 14,000 years later, the gesture still feels familiar, and suddenly, a very uncomfortable question appeared. What exactly was this animal? Because if animals were nothing more than tools, this burial makes very little sense. People don't bury themselves with hunting spears because they loved them. They don't place a hand on a useful object before entering the grave. Yet here was a human being buried beside an animal in a way that feels strangely familiar, almost modern, almost recognizable. You can imagine the scene, the grief, the attachment, the reluctance to let go. And that's the part that should bother us. Because by now, this story is becoming harder and harder to explain through usefulness. The fox wasn't useful. The sick puppy wasn't useful. And now we're looking at evidence that some humans may have cared about animals in ways that looked remarkably similar to how we care about family. Which raises a bigger question. If this wasn't about survival, then what was it really about? To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning. Back before pets. Back before companionship. Back to the moment when one of the most dangerous animals on Earth started hanging around human camps. Of all the animals humans could have befriended, the wolf might be the strangest. Because wolves were not cute. They were not friendly. And they were definitely not pets. Imagine you've spent 3 days tracking a deer. You're exhausted, hungry. Then, just as you're about to bring food back to your family, a pack of wolves appears. The same deer, the same meat, the same survival problem. They're stronger, faster, better hunters. And unlike you, they have teeth designed specifically for this job. If there was one animal Ice Age humans should have hated, it was the wolf, which makes what happened next almost unbelievable. Because somehow, the rival became the ally. Every rabbit they caught was a rabbit you couldn't eat. Every deer they brought down was food your family would never see. And that wasn't the only problem. Wolves were dangerous. Not cartoon dangerous, actually dangerous. A hungry wolf pack could kill the same animals humans depended on, steal food, spread disease, threaten camps. If you were designing the perfect enemy for a hunter-gatherer, you'd end up with something surprisingly close to a wolf. Which is why what happened next is so strange. Humans didn't wipe them out. They didn't chase them away. They didn't build their lives around avoiding them. Somehow, over thousands of years, the relationship went in the exact opposite direction. The animal that should have been a rival became a companion, then an ally, then eventually something much closer to family. And nobody knows exactly how that happened, but many researchers think it may have started with a surprisingly simple change. Not friendship, not training, tolerance. Some wolves were less aggressive than others. Some were willing to stay near human camps. Some were willing to eat scraps instead of fighting for food. And humans, for reasons we still don't fully understand, allowed them to stay. Think about how small that decision is. One wolf isn't chased away. One pup isn't killed. One animal is tolerated for a little longer than it should have been. And then another and another, until one of the most important relationships in human history begins. Not with a grand plan, not with domestication, but with a species making room for another species. Which raises a strange possibility. Maybe humans didn't start caring about animals after dogs appeared. Maybe dogs appeared because humans were already capable of caring. At this point, you might be thinking you've solved the mystery. Humans cared about animals because some animals became useful. Problem solved. Except there's one issue. Humans don't just care about useful animals. We care about tiny animals, weak animals, injured animals, helpless animals, and scientists think they know why. Imagine a newborn baby. Big eyes, round face, small nose, tiny body. Almost everything about it is designed to trigger a response in your brain. Protect this, care for this, keep this alive. And the strange thing is, that response doesn't stop at humans. The same features show up in puppies, kittens, baby seals, even animals we've never interacted with before. Your brain sees something small, vulnerable, and helpless, and immediately starts reaching for the same emotional machinery it uses for children, which is a little unsettling when you think about it, because that means part of your brain doesn't care whether something is human. It cares whether something looks like it needs help. And if that sounds powerful, it gets stranger, because dogs didn't just stumble into this system. Over thousands of years, they became exceptionally good at activating it. Big eyes, expressive faces, attention-seeking behavior, the kinds of traits humans can't seem to ignore. It's almost as if evolution slowly shaped some animals into specialists at getting our attention, and then researchers discovered something that made this idea even harder to dismiss. When humans and dogs look into each other's eyes, something unusual happens. The idea that animals can trigger our protective instincts explains a lot. It explains puppies, it explains kittens, it explains why people suddenly lose all self-respect when a baby seal shows up. But there's a problem. Most animals don't stay babies forever. A full-grown dog doesn't look much like a human infant, and yet people still treat them like family, which means something else must be happening. And in 2015, researchers discovered something strange. They brought dogs and their owners into a room and asked them to do something incredibly simple. Look at each other. That's IT. No commands, no tricks, just eye contact. And what happened next surprised everyone. The longer the dogs and humans looked at each other, the more oxytocin appeared in both of their bodies. Oxytocin is sometimes called the bonding hormone. It's heavily involved in trust, attachment, and one of the strongest relationships humans experience: the bond between parent and child. In other words, simply looking at a dog was activating some of the same biological systems involved in caring for a baby, which is already weird. But then the researchers tried the same thing with wolves, and the effect largely disappeared. The wolves didn't create the same feedback loop, the dogs did. Somewhere along the way, dogs had become exceptionally good at reaching into the human mind and pressing a very specific button. The button that says, "This matters. Stay close. Protect this." And suddenly, a lot of human behavior starts making more sense. The expensive vet bills, the sleepless nights, the people carrying injured dogs home, the people refusing to leave them behind. But there's still a problem, because dogs aren't the only animals humans care about. And some of the most emotional examples in this story involve animals that never went through this process at all, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe we aren't just responding to dogs. Maybe we're responding to something much bigger. At this point, you could argue the mystery is solved. Dogs evolved to connect with humans. Humans evolved to care for vulnerable things. Case closed. Except there's one problem. Some of the most powerful examples in this story have nothing to do with dogs, or domestication, or even humans. Because when researchers began studying animal behavior more closely, they kept running into scenes that felt strangely familiar. An elephant standing beside the bones of another elephant, not for a few seconds, for hours, touching the skull, running its trunk over the remains, returning again and again, as if something about the loss still mattered. Then there are dogs. Dogs that stop eating after losing a companion. Dogs that spend days searching for an animal that isn't coming back. Dogs that wait by doors long after they should have given up. And the strange thing is that humans instantly recognize these behaviors, not because we're scientists, not because we've read the studies, but because we've seen grief before. We've seen it in ourselves, which raises a fascinating possibility. What if part of the reason we care about animals isn't because they're cute or useful, or even because they trigger ancient parenting instincts? What if it's because every now and then they remind us of ourselves, the fear, the attachment, the loyalty, the loss? The emotions look different, but not different enough. And once you start seeing animals that way, something changes, because now you're no longer looking at a creature. You're looking at a mind, different mind, but a mind nonetheless. And that's where this story takes another strange turn, because one dog became so important that an entire city refused to forget him. In the 1920s, a dog named Hachiko used to walk with his owner to a train station in Tokyo. Every day he would wait for him to return. Then one day, the owner died, and Hachiko didn't know it. The next day he came back and waited. Then the next day, and the next, and the next, for nearly 10 years. Every afternoon he returned to the same station, expecting someone who was never coming home. People noticed. They fed him, protected him, looked after him. Eventually he became famous, not because he performed tricks, not because he saved lives, but because people saw something in that story that felt deeply human. Loyalty, hope, loss, the refusal to let go. An entire city emotionally adopted a dog because they understood exactly what he was going through. And that's the strange thing. The more examples you look at, the harder it becomes to draw a clean line between human emotions and animal emotions. Not because they're identical, but because they're similar enough for us to recognize, similar enough to care, similar enough that millions of people around the world would do almost anything to protect them. Which brings us back to the question we've been chasing this entire time. So why do humans risk their lives for animals? The answer isn't that animals are cute. If that were true, nobody would jump into freezing water for a full-grown dog. The answer isn't that animals are useful. If that were true, Ice Age humans wouldn't have spent precious food keeping a dying puppy alive. And the answer isn't simply that dogs learned how to manipulate us, because people formed deep emotional bonds with animals that were never domesticated at all. Foxes, horses, birds, cats, even wild animals they've only known for a short time. The deeper you look, the harder it becomes to find a single explanation. Instead, what you find is a collection of systems all pointing in the same direction. Humans evolved to care, to protect, to nurture, to form relationships, to recognize fear, attachment, loss. And sometimes animals are able to step directly into those systems. A puppy triggers the instincts we evolved for children. A loyal dog triggers the emotions we associate with friendship. A grieving elephant reminds us of our own experiences with loss. And once an animal enters those parts of the mind, something strange happens. It stops feeling like an animal, not completely, but enough. Enough that abandoning it feels wrong. Enough that losing it feels painful, enough that protecting it feels natural, which brings us back to that puppy. 14,000 years ago, somewhere in the Ice Age, a human being looked at a dying animal that offered almost nothing in return. Keeping it alive cost food, time, energy, things that were already in short supply. From a survival perspective, the decision made no sense, but they did it anyway. 14,000 years ago, somebody living in the Ice Age looked at a dying puppy and made a choice. They could have saved the food, saved the time, saved the energy. Instead, they saved the puppy. We don't know their name. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know why they cared, but we know they did. Because thousands of years later, we're still talking about it. Maybe that's the real answer. Not that animals hacked the human brain, not that humans became soft, but that somewhere along the way, evolution gave us the ability to care about something other than ourselves. And once that door opened, it never really closed. The puppy survived, the bond survived, and somehow, 14,000 years later, so did the feeling.